My name is Darren McGarvey. There's a sense of real awareness of the power of this thing. Good shot. Author and hip-hop artist.
Go on, take your hands out of your pockets, please.
This is what I do when I'm about to punch somebody. I've spent a lifetime railing against the middle classes. Why is it the middle class accent we all need to adopt?
Black people who are in low class or middle class get it even worse. It's insane.
I am at a crossroads. Between me and you, there's a massive change there.
You could put 10 millionaires in a room and they'll differentiate and they'll split.
Someone that's worth my time speaking to.
I'm seeing how others live.
There might still be environments in which you will feel unwelcome, may indeed be unwelcome.
I've never actually really considered what class I fall into.
I'm now starting to question my own social class.
It's never, not one iota, held me back.
Next! So, is class still a thing in the 21st century?
It really no longer exists. And some people, I think, perhaps want it to exist.
We were being judged on our postcode. We were made to feel that our postcode defined us.
Are we all born equal, or are some born more equal than others?
There's no class war. It's not a class war. It's a massacre. There's no equal fight here.
All my life, I've been talking about poverty, and all my life, people have been insisting that social class is no longer relevant. But I know it is. I have experienced it on both sides of the tracks. Because of a book I wrote about poverty, I've been afforded the very lifestyle I've spent much of my life slagging off. That experience has even found its way into my music, like my latest song, Run To It. Head full of negative thought. I remember it all in my sleeper cell, eating cereal out of a nog pot, cause the bulls never clean themselves. Hoodie up in a pawn shop, praying these other people aren't seeing me the way I see myself, full of all sorts and whatnot, bevy o'clock. The song is about the very thing I would like to explore, which is not just my journey, but the way I feel I've been perceived by others throughout it, mainly because of my class. In this film, I'm going to prove to you just how entrenched social class remains in Scotland. But don't take it from me. Let's find out what the population think. We're out in the sunny streets of Dundee, annoying the good public to pester them about what their ideas of social class are. I'd like to know how closely their notions match my own. Does class exist?
Yeah, I think it is probably, yeah.
I see it play out almost every day.
There's still a difference between the classes.
No, I would say it's no.
OK, what class are the following? Fish and chips.
Lower class.
Middle class, probably.
Everybody likes fish and chips, there's no class there.
Right. Greg's.
Greg's, working class.
Working class.
Opera and classical music.
I would say that's upper class.
Upper class.
𝗵𝗶𝗯𝗲𝗍,
𝗵𝗶𝗯𝗲𝗍, I would say, is working class.
I'd say higher.
leopard print leggings.
Working class.
Bougie.
Pawnbrokers.
Lower class.
Pawn shops, so I've used them many a time.
What about skiing?
I don't think a lot of people can afford the equipment for skiing.
That's quite high class.
That could be anything. No, lower class, upper class.
Have you ever been skiing?
Yes, I was skiing once up in 𝗄𝗶𝗯𝗲𝗄𝗏 or Glendie.
The ruthless exploitation of humanity and the natural world until exhaustion or collapse.
Elite upper class.
Middle class, I think.
Very good, OK. Buckfast.
Horrendous.
Working class. Higher class. Oh, that's definitely a lower class, definitely.
That's just Scotland, isn't it? Everyone enjoys a bit of that now and again.
Haven't drank that for a while.
I like the fact you have drank it, though. OK, thank you for your help.
Thanks, mate, right?
Thank you.
Everybody's answers are so interesting. You have so many different conceptions of class, and that's part of the reason why the subject is so nebulous, because we're all working from a different social vantage point and different terminology. Even where the definitions differed, most people still acknowledged the existence of class. Historically, we have been much more fixated on it than any other Western country. My understanding of my place in the world was very much shaped by my grandmother. It sort of boiled down to, we are this certain type of people, and then there are the other people who have more than us. To illustrate this upstairs-downstairs world of social class, I have decided to upgrade. Welcome to Lauriston Castle. Last occupied by the Reid family in 1926, this living museum is a perfect time capsule to explore our obsession with social class. At the time, the technological revolution, with its manifold advances like Edison's light bulb and Kelvin's telegraph, was improving life across the country at an exponential rate. It was a bit like the dot-com boom of the 1990s, where people who had been maybe regarded as quite obscure professionally, with special skills that no one really understood, were suddenly just raking in money. Which meant that for the country's aristocrats, those all-important markers of distinction, like the luxuries one could afford oneself, became increasingly important. You just can't deny, as tasteless as this sort of wealth might seem, that it's a very attractive sort of lifestyle, because it's all about comfort. It's all about rinsing the absolute most out of every moment in life, living it to the absolute max. You wake up to that every morning, you sort of just begin your day with, wow, it's a beautiful world. It's a great world. I really don't understand why all those people in that slum down the road are so blooming furious all the time. Why can't they just get it together? Look what we've achieved. Now for a game of croquet. But I didn't come here just to follow in the footsteps of those well-heeled few. We are now going to descend the servant staircase. Really the first time that the soles of your feet meet a harsh stone floor. Interesting that this actually reminds me of a kind of traditional tenement close. Maybe that's modelled on the classic servant staircase. This is the maid's room. It's certainly not intolerable, but certainly not as comfortable as before. I came across these earlier. So this is obviously for some kind of educational stuff that they do. But it kind of struck me that while this is obviously a representation of the class system and the time that people were living in this building, it's surprisingly familiar. What has changed are the numbers. In the 1920s, almost 3/4 of the working population were considered working class. These days, it's only 1/4. But 60% of us still regard ourselves as working class. So what's going on? For me, class is about much more than what you earn or what you do. From its very inception, it was designed to let people make judgments on your morality and respectability. And that is precisely what's led to some of the prejudices that I encounter day to day. The number one question that I get asked is, Darren, where did you learn to speak so well? Why are you so articulate? Now, I know that this question is meant as a tremendous compliment, but what it betrays about the people who ask it is that they are very surprised that someone like me is capable of constructing coherent sentences without defecating themselves. It would appear that regardless of how much care I take when I speak, that something is encoded deep within the substructure of my accent that often conveys something entirely different from what I intend. It conveys, in the words of Piers Morgan, that I am a raging lunatic. Not long ago, I appeared on an episode of BBC's Question Time. COVID-19 is an unknown quantity. I still don't know very basic things about it. So while I do accept and I don't dismiss completely those arguments for loosening the lockdown, particularly for those impacted who might be in some kind of danger, COVID-19, we just don't know enough about it. And we just don't know what sort of genie we're letting out of the bottle.
All right, Darren, sorry to interrupt. Just to see, we've got you back, and you're very keen to come in now.
Filmed from my home and riddled with technical problems, I didn't realise the broadcast was live and occasionally talked over other contributors. This led to not just Piers taking aim at me, but many others following his lead. I suspect that their comments had something to do with the fact that my own Glaswegian accent is considered amongst the least attractive in the UK. And I want to know why that is. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Welcome to Lauriston Castle. I'm sure you'll agree it's beautiful.
Your humble abode.
Yes, indeed. Will we go and have a look? To find out, I'm meeting Professor Jane Stewart-Smith, who's been working at Glasgow University for the last 20 years. Can you imagine the heating bill for this place? She's a sociolinguist and an expert in how people express their identity through language. Luckily for me, Jane specialises in the Glaswegian dialect. What have you found about Glaswegian in terms of how it's distinct from other regional dialects?
What has happened in English dialects is that there's been the loss of local dialect features, whereas the Glasgow dialect has become more distinct rather than less distinct. What we are interested in when we talk about phonetics is how we produce speech. Accents are produced with everybody that has fundamentally a very similar vocal tract. So traditional Glaswegian used to have a very retracted tongue root, but the settings of the vocal tract have changed in Glaswegian since the First World War. So they were more and now they're more
Why Glasgow and not like Edinburgh, for example?
There's something special about the city. In the early 1900s, Glasgow was described as the largest village in the world. These close-knit networks, which are so important for language. Linguistically, you've got this really, really interesting situation with the expression of identity. It's one way that people can fight back, because if they come from a deprived area, what can they do?
Well, it's good to know that that sense of pride that Glaswegians have is not 100% hubris. Jane has agreed to analyse the first series I ever presented for BBC Scotland. My name is Darren McGarvey, 𝗏𝗏 the Scottish rapper to some, and I want to immerse you in the world that I grew up in.
Now, I liked this.
And I want to immerse you.
Immerse you.
Yeah.
But then...
You almost sound French when you try to do that.
Yes, because it's a 𝗔𝗓.
All right, OK.
And would anybody say that saying 𝟕 in French is bad or slang or ugly?
No.
No. You have a 𝗔𝗓. You produce it in the same way as a French person, but it's not associated with loveliness.
Yeah. Quite.
This is the important bit, and you really want people to listen to you.
A world defined by poverty.
A world defined by poverty. And this is what you're doing with your language. But you kind of take people unawares, because you say community, 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 and then community, where it's important. Society, society, responsibility. So whatever's happening in the planning of your speech, you are aligning the social, cultural importance of what you're saying to your audience, and it's getting the linguistic repertoire, which is needed at the time.
Yeah. I am often being told that class is no longer a thing, but language, more than any other area for me, is where it's most evident.
Various pieces of research, like language attitudes research, shows that as soon as we hear somebody, we make social judgments about them. And those social judgments have got nothing to do with actually what they're saying or how they say it, but rather It's the connection between certain speech styles with particular stereotypes. Accentism is like the last kind of prejudice, because people are still kind of allowed to use accent as a vehicle to make social judgments about other people.
It's because it's class, and class has fallen to the bottom of the current hierarchy of concerns.
Yes. Well, it's falling to the bottom because everybody's pretending it's not there. But as an RP, standard English speaker, I'm lucky because literally studies have shown that if I was to say something in my accent, people will believe it. Whereas if you were to say exactly the same thing in your accent, they wouldn't believe it. And it's scary, but it's been demonstrated again and again.
Yeah.
Part of being middle class and being educated is the way you talk. You have to speak properly. And if you don't, that's a problem. So if you move socially, you've got to do something to your language. And if you're stuck socially, it's almost like it's a kind of prison.
That was kind of bittersweet for me, if I'm honest. It was very interesting to hear the level of detail that Jane was able to go into about the decisive role that language plays and how we see ourselves in other people and other social classes. But there was a sense also of disappointment. I think when you actually see the contours of how class is restricting you, you're left with a mixture of resignation and shame, to be honest. And I'm not the only one. Research at the University of Manchester has shown that a third of people who consciously posh up their accents to fit in, like when I pronounce poverty, feel that same sense of shame. And this is just one of the many reasons that the people of Dundee found class so difficult to define. The problem is, class is about more than just the money in your pocket. It's about the material those pockets are made of. It's about the accent the person wearing them speaks with. And it's about the sports they play. 100 years ago, if you wanted to get into sport, then you followed a path roughly along lines of your social class. So upper class people tended to gravitate towards sports that were individual, that required buying expensive equipment or gaining access to clubs with large fees. Whereas working class people tended to gravitate towards sports that involve power and strength, like football and boxing. You don't need me to tell you any of that. The interesting thing is that, and this was confirmed by a key report, in the subsequent 100 years, not a great deal has changed. And golf is still ridiculous. Partly, this is about state schools not having access to the same facilities at the same level as fee-paying schools. But the issue of class in sports also goes deeper. It's about perception. If we truly want to understand attitudes around class, we have to view class as an identity, not just in terms of how an individual might regard themselves, but how they may be regarded by the wider society. There's no better way of doing that than examining the history of Scotland's secret sport. Cricket has been played in Scotland for nearly 250 years, but it's still largely seen as a middle-class English pursuit, and it's easy to see why. Until 1962, England's professional cricketers were divided into two categories: working-class players and middle-class gentlemen. Until then, Lords, the home of cricket, required that working-class players access the grounds using a different entrance from their middle-class peers. Today, although cricket certainly has its working-class heroes like Ben Stokes or Freddie Flintoff, fewer working-class players reach the top of the English game than at probably any time in its history. But is it any different here in Scotland, where it's less mainstream? To find out, I'm in Inverness, catching up with father and son, John and Will, who've been members of the Northern Counties Cricket Club here for over 10 years. In terms of the common perception among many people around cricket, that same kind of veneer that Wimbledon has of it being very pricey, how do you find the reality measures up to the conception of it?
You're right in talking about cricket and the perception of class and this perception of cucumber sandwiches and pavilions and people having cups of tea during the break and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's how it was and probably how it is in some places.
It's still very much seen, sadly, as an English sport up here, and we'll always compete against football and in rugby. We're well below them as far as participation goes, but the way we've done it, and it's been the right way, is to go right in at grassroots.
They set up the cricket club in 1864 and with a specific aim of including everyone, landed or meek, I think was the way they termed it. The most important thing was that you were interested in playing cricket.
I may not be counted among the landed, but it's time to throw on some Aran wool and ankle pads and play the part. It's very typical, the one day that I don't have a baseball cap on me, it's the day where I come somewhere and everyone is wearing a baseball cap. Of course, they're wearing theirs for practicality reasons. I'm not wearing mine because I'm trying to look like less of a Ned. I'm going to join a quick six-a-side to find out a little bit more about how the game matches up to my perception of it.
Great stuff!
What does that mean?
He's out.
Right,
Big
okay.
Balls. Next man, please.
So I done better than him?
Yep. So far, so good.
Yay! Great stuff, great stuff.
Oh, yes. Now that felt good, didn't it?
Very good, we're done. Okay, honestly, that was a lot more fun than I expected.
I'll tell you what, for a first-time player, you did very well. Good shots. Good shots. Well done.
But I'd still like to catch up with Casey and John from the Highlands Cricket Club for their take on the sport. There's a kind of perception of cricket being associated with a particular social class, people who come from money.
Yeah.
And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
In London, some of the big cricket grounds, apparently there's a waiting list of years to get a membership, and there's strict rules about how you present yourself and get through. And it's all that kind of gives you a perception that this is very class-oriented. When I first came up to Inverness, I was a bit anxious to approach clubs because I thought probably, you know, I wouldn't get a chance. But the number of people that have come from various backgrounds, it's definitely, it's a testimony that it's not ruled or divided by class anymore.
Where did you both grow up?
I grew up in St. Lucia, Caribbean. Cricket was just a sport that it was readily available for us to play and that.
And what was your understanding of class as a way of thinking about the world when you were growing up?
Some people, I think, they're better off than others. But for me, growing up, there wasn't this whole thing with like so much of this person is this class and you're that class.
What about you? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Africa, but I'm Indian by background. My parents travelled a lot. Most of my childhood was in a boarding school set up, pretty much oriented to the British way of upbringing, and this is in India. To play cricket, it's very, very inclusive. It's played in streets and all around. There's no divisions based on where you come from, what you do, what's your job, what's your class.
And this is exactly why cricket is such a useful lens through which to view class. Although the game is played across the world, predominantly in the post-colonial countries, only in England does it have such a distinct class identity.
And the problem isn't even with the cricket. In a way, the problem is with me.
If I'm coming into something like this with a fixed idea, then I actually sort of deny myself the potential of new opportunities to move from an identity that's been ascribed to me as a working class person who does this, this and this, and into a sense of achieved identity where I begin to identify myself by what it is that I do and what my interests are.
And that difference between how you are defined by others and how you define yourself is crucial. Don't believe me? Then consider that nearly half of people who work in managerial or professional positions, the very heart of the middle class, identify as working class. But what if you are working class and want to achieve a middle class identity? Well, then you'll need to raise your social standing.
And what better way of doing that than by getting lessons in gentlemanly conduct from a conduit between the social classes? It's time to meet butler Simeon. Hello, Simeon.
Good morning, Darren. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Yourself?
I'm very well, thank you.
I am looking for salvation and redemption in the eyes of the socially obtuse and aloof. I'm hearing that you might be able to help me upgrade.
Well, I don't think you need redemption. What I'm here to tell you is about you being the best possible person you can be. Firstly, a gentleman never ever wears a hat indoors.
Okay.
So the hat's got to
right.
The hat's got to go. You know the old expression, pull your socks up?
Yes.
Pull your socks up.
Okay.
So your socks need to go right up to just under your knee. You know, like if you're wearing a kilt?
Yeah. Is that okay?
That looks much better.
Right, okay. There we go.
Very good. Now, the next thing, let's look at your posture and your poise.
Okay.
It's saying something about you. And is it what you want to say? You don't look like you're interested in what I'm saying because of the way you're standing. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, your hands in your pockets, you're slouching. Go on, take your hands out of your pockets, please. Take your hands out of your pockets. Go on. That would immediately, to me, make you look more like you're engaged in the room.
Often these traits that we regard as being an expression of high values and high culture and respectable behaviour, they don't actually serve any practical function. I don't speak or rap that differently from how Robert Burns writes, but things receive cultural prominence because upper class people like them, middle class people mimic upper class people, and this just becomes the canon.
You know, you're basically right. And I was actually thinking about this when I saw you and I looked at you and I was thinking, do I feel more confident talking to you dressed like that than I would do if you were in your jogging trousers, etc. And I'm thinking, yes, I do. Because I take one look at you and I'm thinking this is someone that's worth my time speaking to.
I went to the Houses of Parliament in 2019 and the thing that I really observed was you have people who are dressed to indicate a certain kind of class and they speak to indicate a certain kind of class, but then they can kind of collaborate in some of the most vulgar and socially damaging policies that we've seen.
But it's a very diverse mix of people who sit in the House of Parliament. It's not...
Well, it's not though. Less and less working class people get into Parliament in the first place. You're wrong about that, but I understand why you think that, because people in your social class think all sorts of things that aren't right, but they walk around and they speak a certain way and they dress a certain way, which suggests they're right, so everyone believes them.
But Darren, it's not my social class. I grew up in like a rough neighbourhood, yeah? I left home when I was 18 years old, had about 100 quid in my pocket, not enough to pay 1 month's rent, yeah? Got a job as a waiter and like worked my way out. Now I run a butler school, I'm CEO of a company, etc., etc. And to me, I look at the wealth class system as being an aspirational thing that you can move through. I've worked for so many people who've started with basically nothing. And sometimes I think it's an excuse to say, I can't make something of myself because I've come from nothing. It's open for anyone to work their way up.
And if they wear a suit, it makes it a lot easier, apparently.
I think it does.
No, I agree.
I genuinely think it does.
I agree. I wasn't expecting this kind of dynamic, but it was just like, there's something about being told to get your hands out your pockets, which is just like, oh, is that fucking right? It was just like, my hands are in my pocket, this is what I do when I'm about to punch somebody. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just kind of stand there like, all right, okay, cool, let's hear it, you know?
When I look at someone who's wealthy, my chip has been like, I will be the first one up in the morning, last one to bed, until I am that person, yeah?
Yeah, I admire that, I really do. But I also know, because I'm not too remote from what life is like at the bottom, I have to temper that sort of American dream mentality with the reality that it doesn't always work like that for people.
Of course it doesn't always work. Not everyone can do that.
The minute that I walked into that room, I felt a real struggle. It was the way he said, get your hands out your pocket. It took me back somewhere. Suddenly I felt this desire to assert myself. It annoyed me that he came from a similar background to me, but had very much become accustomed and adjusted to seeing the world through the eyes of the super privileged.
Those super privileged people inhabit society's top tier. Only 6% of the UK population dwell in the upper classes, but it's no wonder they set the agenda. 43% of newspaper columnists, 75% of senior judges, and 64% of the sitting cabinet were privately educated.
In Scotland, the figures are comparable, but they play a far less conspicuous role in public life. In fact, you would be forgiven for not even realising they were Scottish at all. In an era preceding television and radio, the Edinburgh bourgeois sought the aid of elocution lessons to help iron out the Scotticisms and mimic a more English form of speech.
These days, you can hear it all over the city. It identifies them as clearly as my accent identifies me. There's no way of understanding class in Scotland without understanding the reclusive Scottish elite. So today, I'm meeting one of their number.
I'm a complete novice at croquet. I've got a feeling that you might have a slight advantage over me.
Maybe like a genetic one?
𝗂𝗶𝗯𝗲 is a journalist and son of former Tory Cabinet Minister Sir Malcolm Rifkind. He's mingled with everyone from royalty to Eurocrats, celebrities to billionaires. So what separates someone like him from someone like me?
OK, blue.
It's time to find out over a gentlemanly game of croquet.
You've definitely got the knack of what direction it should go in.
It's nice having 2 balls each time because you can kind of mess one up and then you're kind of, you know what you're doing with the second one.
Yeah.
A few years ago, Hugo wrote an article arguing it was time for Scotland's timid posh folk to stand up and be counted.
Your article in The Spectator that you wrote is kind of tightly bound up in the English accent or the lack of a broad Scottish accent, which actually, when I thought about it, it's really strange because most of the people I know from Edinburgh speak like me.
It's a bit strange to have this assumption that you're not from where you're from. It's a bit disempowering in a way because you've got to be from somewhere, and it's like, well, I'm not from Scotland. Where I'm at, you can't be like just generally from England. You know, you've got to be from a place.
I saw some parallels actually. There's a sense, even though I wouldn't assume it, of you and maybe people from your background feeling kind of marginalised culturally.
It's kind of normal in Scotland to associate privilege with people not really being Scottish, not truly Scottish, not properly Scottish. What does it say about a nation that defines itself as underprivileged? That to be privileged is to cease to be from that nation. But it does mean that there's this class there, still with power, which is often a hereditary power, that's just not kind of showing its face. That invisibility of privilege in Scotland. What that bleeds down into a kind of a silence of the professional classes generally. And even the professional classes, we're talking about a relatively small bit of society, but it's an important bit of society. It's a powerful bit of society. If you don't hear what they're saying, then you don't get to discuss their motives, then you don't get to have an honest conversation about the national kind of direction.
So you left Scotland when?
I went to university in England when I was 18. I went to Cambridge. I didn't like the shape of my future here. I could see a future where I went on to work for one of a number of companies in Edinburgh where everyone knew my dad, and that was it, you know, and the things I was interested in, none of that seemed to be happening in my world.
Hugo's sense of detachment from his origins feels surprisingly familiar.
This is the nature of getting on, that my interests are changing. I would hate to think that I am now going on that journey a lot of people go on, where they start to think class doesn't really matter. Not for one reason, it would be terribly humiliating and embarrassing. What class would you identify yourself as then?
What I ought to say is upper, right? Because people would look at me and say upper. David Cameron would call himself upper middle. I don't think I quite come from the same class as David Cameron. But then I'm also aware that for a lot of people, I mean, that's just nonsense. Of course I do.
What class am I?
I mean, I don't think class always directly maps onto earnings. There might still be environments in which you will feel unwelcome, will always feel unwelcome, may indeed be unwelcome, you know, and no amount of money will necessarily change that. I can get richer or poorer. I'll still have access to much the same places in much the same kind of way. I have a kind of this resilience as a result of my upbringing. And that, I mean, really, I'm probably not phrasing it very well, but if you're trying to boil down to the advantage of a privileged upbringing, it's basically that.
It was interesting meeting Hugo, because I never thought that people with his accent could feel the same sense of marginalisation as people with mine. And that was unexpected. But Hugo escaped his situation simply by moving, and that's easier done by someone from Edinburgh's Morningside than Glasgow's Pollok. The gulf that separates us is not just financial, it's everything from accent to etiquette, the sports we play to the clothes we wear. It's the histories and traditions we have written for ourselves. And the problem is, that history directly affects our future.
So if what's in the rear-view mirror can shape where we're going, how do we change direction?
In other words, can we hack people's perception? Can changing the way we appear, the way we express ourselves to others, ever be enough to alter our class identities? To find out, I've enlisted some unconventional help.
Ta, 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 ta. Ta, 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 ta.
Actress and vocal coach Kirsty Strain has allowed me to sit in on one of her elocution lessons.
T, 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 T.
We're joined by Amanda, a single mum from Glasgow's Red Road flats who's trying to reduce the strength of her accent.
T, T.
And Pamela, who moved from America to the UK 40 years ago and is looking to bring some Scottish into her American.
T, 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 T. So if we take another word like better, were you saying better or were you saying better?
Both. I think the first one.
So there's better, which is better is not using the tongue at all, and better is using the middle of the tongue. Can you see how I'm not using the tip of my tongue at all and I'm using the middle of my tongue, what that does to my speech immediately?
Yeah,
and how it narrows everything. So we use the tip of the tongue. Better.
Better.
Yeah.
So difficult, that one.
What use are you making of all of this wonderful elocution?
As an American, people hear that first and they just, I'm an American. They ask if I'm here on holiday. You know, they express surprise if I say I've lived here for 40 years. And my partner is Glaswegian and so speaks like you guys all speak. And so I thought if I just softened up a bit, so that maybe people were curious about where I was from, because a lot of people never get to know the real me.
That's just interesting. I can just see with you, it's about belonging.
Mm-hmm.
And
Very
you know, when you talk about it, it's really affecting to see that.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that.
Yeah. What about you? What is your hope in taking part?
You know, I'm so proud to be Scottish. Like, I love it. I love being a Glaswegian. But I had quite a strong Glaswegian accent where somebody that's maybe even just English, like, struggle to understand and you need to keep repeating yourself and stuff like that. Professional-wise, if I was to walk into an interview and me, Amanda from Red Road Flats showed up, I think they would see me a bit differently than speaking maybe with a bit more articulation.
Why is it the middle class accent we all need to adopt? And why, if people have to become more flexible, is that where they need to show their flexibility?
It's because they won't.
I don't see myself as taking it into a middle class zone. All it really is to make sure that it's understood. Prejudice exists, and we're not going to eradicate that overnight. So we have to find ways in.
Taking that first step toward the people who don't see a need for change is the essential step.
Where do you sit with it all?
See, I look up to people like Lemmy, right?
Yeah.
Now, one of the things about Lemmy that inspired me when I was younger was the fact that he retained his accent. I've attached a lot of importance to sounding like I'm from Pollok. See, for me, it's where I come from. It's in my head all the time.
I had a friend who, coming from a council estate, goes to Australia, does really well, no matter how well this girl did, comes back, speaks a little bit quieter, a little bit different, and she got a thrashing.
I like to think that I retain certain aspects of my speech because I'm representing where I come from, or is it partly about me just constantly trying to get the approval? Like, to be all right now, guys, you have to go absolutely fucking nowhere in life, and you need to be angry all the time. You know, like, it's just, I can feel myself getting emotional, you know, just thinking about it. It's making me question what my attitude was when I came in at first.
I understand that Amanda and Pamela's desires to change their speech stem from a quest for self-improvement and acceptance. There is nothing wrong with that. But while becoming more articulate may open the door to a more inclusive dialogue, it's not enough to close the door to the subtlety of prejudice.
One thing that's really jumped out to me from that session was that that subtlety occurs on both sides of the economic divide. I am as self-conscious about my accent when I speak to people I perceive as middle class as I am when I speak to people I perceive as working class. And it really took that lesson from Kirsty for that to really hit home. Here's a big irony for me, right? I make my name rallying against a system that is, according to me, deeply unequal and doesn't distribute opportunity fairly. Because of the way that I go on about that, I then am given loads of opportunities. And actually then, ironically, I'm held up as a poster child by some for how the system works well.
The space that I currently occupy, this transition between classes, is known as social mobility, and it's been slowing in the UK for the last 40 years. Right now, Britain has the worst social mobility of any country in the Western world. But I'm going to take you back to a time and location where that wasn't the case. Post-war Aberdeen. In the 1970s, Aberdeen experienced an oil boom and an explosion of jobs, making the post-war generation there especially socially mobile. Luckily for me, researchers at the University of Aberdeen have a unique set of records on those born there, known as the Children of the 50s cohort study. Originally, it was designed to look at Aberdonians' health, but it has provided invaluable data on social mobility. So does the social mobility experienced by that 50s cohort differ from my own so many years later? To find out, I've invited two people from the very study, Jackie and Rod, for a chat. We're joined by academic 𝗓𝗃, who's been examining social mobility with members of the cohort over the last 3 years.
You both hail from traditionally working class backgrounds. What does social mobility mean to you?
The idea of moving upwards in terms of job, in terms of income.
What about yourself? What does social mobility mean to you, sir?
Well, I would think social mobility would be, depending upon where you're brought up, it's how you then carve out a better life for yourself.
Okay. We come to you.
Yeah, so social mobility essentially is how your destination in life is related to what your parents did for a living. One of the reasons I focus my research on the children of the 1950s in Aberdeen is that there were so many opportunities that you didn't really have to move. And these days, social mobility often has to come together with geographical mobility. In order to get on the ladder, you need to leave. And not everyone wants to leave their communities.
Get out of the shithole, so to speak, which is definitely what we were kind of taught. I am on paper now middle class, right? But I don't feel middle class as I imagine middle class to be. Have either of you experienced difficulties or challenges or other observations when you move from a community where there appears to be a certain way of speaking, a certain way of maybe even appearing, and then you start transitioning into a different community?
I mean, I was fortunate enough to get a start in the oil industry, and because of the salaries that you could earn, I was able to move into, shall we say, a more affluent area. But I never felt that I didn't belong there.
It's interesting to hear that, because that's the opposite of my experience. So I'm interested maybe to know what your experience has been in this regard.
I suppose what comes to mind is when I went off to university, I had really good grades. So I went to St Andrews and, oh God, I so hated it. I just did not fit in. There was a high number of very privileged people went there. The kind of overall feel of it was that, no, this is not your place.
Okay. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on this period of time being very good for social mobility, more people being able to move up because there was more work. Today, I feel like those opportunities aren't there, but a lot of people who grew up in that time struggle to understand that the opportunities that they were afforded when they were younger don't exist anymore.
I agree entirely. When we were growing up, there were lots of jobs around, many more jobs around. People would say things like, oh, I'm leaving this job, and they'd get another one the next week.
That's right.
That happened all the time.
There's loads of apprenticeships that you could go into when we were leaving school.
Yeah.
You know, all the building trades. You used to get the adverts in the newspapers. There would be maybe like 2 pages full of adverts for jobs.
Yeah.
How does the situation with social mobility now, for someone who's maybe just about to enter the labour market, how does that contrast with these experiences?
From what we can tell in the research, education crucially wasn't that important. You could get on well because there was so much on-the-job training. If you want to become a nurse, you don't need to go straight to uni. If you want to become a social worker, you don't need to go to uni. There were different avenues to achieve exact goals, and now that's not really the case.
Today, considerably fewer non-graduates find work than those with a degree, and the work itself is lower paid. This wasn't always the case. In the 1980s, far fewer people went into higher education. Now half of all under 30s do. So doing well in the modern day means not just leaving the community you grew up in, but going to uni. Which provides yet another barrier to social mobility: education. something that Chris, who grew up in Poland, has experienced for himself.
Personal question this time. What social class do you identify as?
So, well, that's a difficult question, because obviously I come from working class backgrounds, but I don't think I can say that I identify with being working class. I'm an academic. I study class and social mobility, but you know, doing a PhD and being so far educationally removed from what my parents did for a living, I kind of function a little bit like I function in two different worlds. So I have to switch when I'm going back home, and then I have to switch back to something else when I'm in academia. You can never fully go back to where you come from, but you will never fully be the kind of person like other people in the place that you find yourself in. You're this in-betweener, a stranger, if you will.
For me, it leads to a sense of permanent displacement, where sometimes you feel quite attached either way, but you're always just kind of transitioning between these two kind of modes.
These days, you might find there's a lot of people like myself, like you, who find it quite problematic.
So, let's say you come from a deprived background and want to be as socially mobile as Jackie and Rod were. But let's say you aren't keen on moving location, don't have a head for academia, are happy with your local dialect, and your cricket or croquet skills are not quite as hot as mine. Historically, there's always been one more avenue you could take: marriage.
So what is it like to marry between social classes? Is it the Prince Charming and Cinderella story that many of us hope for? And as online dating becomes the norm, is it happening even more today?
To find out, I've asked along senior research fellow Rachel Statham.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Lauriston Castle.
Welcome to your castle, yeah. Thanks very much.
She's been working for the Institute of Public Policy Research, examining the history of cross-class marriage and how it's changed over the years.
Let's talk about the research, which started in the 70s, is that right?
Yeah, so if you look at women born in the 1950s and what their prospects look like, we see over a third of them marrying somebody in the same class as their own. And if you look at women born 20 years later, in the late 1970s, the early 80s, we see kind of almost 2/3 of those women are marrying somebody in the same class as the one that they belong to. So before, we might have seen women concentrated in kind of admin positions to improve their prospects. Marrying a rich man was a kind of sure way to do that.
Obviously, the picture's not entirely bleak. I mean, one of the success stories here, it seems to me, is that women generally have more prospects. So the idea of just marrying a man being your only route out of poverty is not the case anymore, and this obviously has to be celebrated.
There's really good news that women have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves, independent of, of who they partner up with, of who they marry. But what is concerning is now we're seeing wealth concentrated in a smaller number of households at the top end, and at the other end of the spectrum particularly, we see poverty concentrated in households who both parents won't have had access to those opportunities. And so this is one of the factors contributing to widening inequality across our society.
So while in the past marriage may have assisted social mobility, these days it's entrenching inequality. And actually, my conversation with Rachel has made me reassess my own improved situation.
The social mobility that I've enjoyed in the last couple of years, some might think is evidence that social mobility still exists in the way it did, but my upward social mobility has been very unconventional.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, I don't think that what has happened in the last couple of years would have been possible if it wasn't for my wife's parents. That's something that's probably occurring to me now with more clarity than ever before.
Yeah.
I guess in a way, have married up.
You think about the resources that wealthier families have. I think the circumstances you're born into are still making a massive difference to what your outcomes look like throughout your life.
What are your experiences in terms of, how does this play out in your life?
But my mum was a nurse and my dad was a doctor, so she came from, working class rural Scotland. My dad was an English grammar school boy who grew up in a middle-class family. I think that's quite a good example of what we're talking about here. But I think now we're more likely to see wealthier households or wealthier people marrying other wealthy people and passing that wealth on to their children.
As someone who grew up in poverty, notice the pronunciation of the T there, because I'm about to say something that I think is really important. Right? I'm used to being examined by middle-class professionals, right, in every way you can imagine. So middle-class doctors, middle-class judges, middle-class social workers. Even when middle-class experiences are examined, they are examined and scrutinised by other middle-class people.
Yeah.
When I'm prodding you
yeah.
for more information about your personal life, in this context, I can tell it's a bit uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Because it's an unusual experience for you to go through.
You know, I don't have much of a story that I might tell myself, but that in itself is, you know, is kind of an indicator of my privilege.
The striking thing about talking to Rachel isn't just the fact that we are becoming more and more divided as a society. It's the fact that bridges across that division, like the story of our own mum and dad, are few and far between. Not because a doctor can no longer marry a nurse, but because a nurse now needs a minimum of 3 years at university.
My success, or perceived success, is not just down to me. It's not just down to hard work. I had a ridiculous run of luck. Now, some of that luck I earned, but some of it I didn't. Some of it I didn't. I've been shown immense generosity. People from very privileged backgrounds decided to help me. And that is what gave me the advantage, if I'm being completely honest.
Class has never been a simple concept to define. How you spend your weekdays is a good place to start. If your occupation is manual, low-paid, routine, or even non-existent.
But baked into those more measurable social facts are subtleties and sensitivities which often escape our notice. How we speak, how we dress, what we eat, who we marry. There are those who insist that class as a concept is no longer relevant, and some who even argue that it doesn't exist. One sympathises, but with all due respect, whether you choose to believe in gravity or not is a personal choice, but your belief has absolutely no bearing on the tremendous force it exerts over everything. Now try and imagine me doing that monologue with a big slash mark down my face.
Sobriety offers a gift of sanity, something you could never imagine. Put your head in the pillow at night, back on the wagon, no need to compare yourself to your peers, indulging in aggressive, repetitive bragging. But skipping meetings cause the all the distractions that happen when the stuff you spent your life working towards actually happens. Bends you out of shape, your ego expands and contracts, and picking the threads of your peace of mind as the fabric unravels.